The truth is, the vast majority of men who have fulfilled crucial roles in history have done so nameless. This is especially clear today, when our Ukrainian brothers are lining up to do the same. Men losing their lives by the hundreds and then the thousands. Well, here we are, standing on the Lexington Common, the very ground where what would have been a normal April 19th turned into the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Hello everyone, I'm James McQuivey, and welcome. Welcome to part 2 of my 4-part series on the Men of Freedom. 4 men who I cover who stood up to support their communities at a time of upheaval and, in some cases, paid for it with their lives. Welcome back to April 19th, 1775. If you're just catching up on my video series, I have 2 videos that precede this one. One that describes the 5 years of turmoil that led up to that fateful April morning, and another that starts the evening of April 18th with Paul Revere and William Dawes riding out of Boston after curfew via 2 different routes to warn the citizens of Concord that their gunpowder and cannon were about to be seized. And, crucially, that the 700 British troops would come by sea, meaning across the wide waters of the Charles River and into Cambridge, from there marching across Cambridge through Menotomy, today called Arlington, and into Lexington, where we are now, a distance of about 13 miles. The troops' ultimate destination was Concord. Now that's another 12 miles still ahead, and we'll get there in my next video. But today, we're going to focus on this halfway point, Lexington Common. Today, in the state of Massachusetts, we celebrate the anniversary of this event as something we call Patriots Day. It's a state holiday, and it's pinned to the Monday closest to April 19th. It's also the day that the Boston Marathon is run, and I have several videos about that if you're interested. Go look those up. But for those of you keeping track at home, the original Patriots Day happened on a Wednesday, April 19th, 1775. Now, in my last video, I explained that General and Governor Thomas Gage had been authorized to send forces to Concord in order to confiscate gunpowder, arms, and cannon. I also said that he was authorized to arrest 2 Patriot leaders, John Hancock and Samuel Adams. Yes, the man the beer is named after. They were believed by the British to be in Lexington, and they actually were here. One of the reasons that Paul Revere stopped in Lexington on his way to Concord was to warn them of the impending arrival of the troops. I want to pause here for a moment because if you look up nearly any source that describes that day, you will find nearly universal agreement that arresting Hancock and Adams was the plan of the British. This was a belief held by the people present that day, those here on the Common. It was believed by Hancock and Adams as well, which is why, duly warned, they fled Lexington ahead of the troops' arrival. In fact, the retelling of the intention of the British, the illegal arrest of Patriot leaders, was crucial to the way the news of the day was communicated as far away as Connecticut. As writers went further and further to warn of the British regulars' malfeasance, the story they told about that intended arrest got grander and more embellished. In one contemporary account, for example, rumors spread that the British regulars had sacked a house here in Lexington, believing that Hancock and Adams were hiding inside, and upon not finding them, killed the family that resided there, including the women and the children. Of course, no such thing happened that morning. No house was ransacked. In fact, no attempt was even made to locate and arrest Hancock and Adams. And it's because of this that I want to pause here and reflect on this issue. Because there is a serious argument to be made, and is being made among historians, that the British never intended to arrest Hancock and Adams. J.L. Bell, in his book The Road to Concord, makes what I think is a compelling case that the rumors about impending arrest, though widely believed at the time by the colonists, were simply that, rumors. Effective rumors to be sure, but still what we would today call fake news or misinformation. Surely General Gage was watching the Sons of Liberty, a secret organization that's behind much of the social unrest at the time, to which Hancock and Adams belonged, and where they were leaders, yes. But it turns out there is nothing in the orders that Gage received from his British superiors, or in the orders that he then gave Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, who was to lead the troops out to Concord, that authorized that arrest. Now, I dwell on this for two reasons. First, it is maddeningly difficult to pin down what really happened on a single day in history just 247 years ago. There were many contemporary accounts. This was illiterate people, after all. It's not like we're trying to reconstruct a single day in the history of, ancient Egypt or something. This just happened for all practical purposes, and it happened right here. Some of the buildings that witnessed it still stand. It's humbling to realize how hard it is to ascertain the truth of this single event. And I think that humility, well, it's useful today. We see a lot of propaganda, misinformation, and disinformation spread today. And we think that this is a new phenomenon. We're the first that have ever had to deal with copious amounts of false information, but we're not. And realizing that might actually give us some perspective so that we don't have to overreact to the amount of information we face today and act as if it's some kind of peril from which we will never recover. They dealt with it imperfectly, but they ultimately survived it, and we can too. The second reason to dwell on this is to tee up today's recounting of the events that transpired here on Lexington Common in the early light of dawn. Because although it is often referred to as the Battle of Lexington, there really was no battle here. The minor skirmish, it was over in minutes. A series of poor judgments, some tired men on both sides of the line who had been up all night, combined to leave 8 men dead, and the British column essentially unperturbed as it then left Lexington to continue on to Concord in search of gunpowder and cannon. Now, because this small event had such profound consequences, you can understand why there has been a tendency to exaggerate what happened here. And I don't mean not exaggerate its importance. It is absolutely important what happened here. And of course, the tragic loss of those 8 lives, as I'll explain, was devastating to this small community. But the event itself, just a few minutes in time on which the balance of history rests, was not actually that big of a deal. This just feels wrong to say. And so in many of the retellings that would begin that very day, all of them designed to inspire, overawe the listener, and in some cases ultimately motivate them to support a rebellion against the British regular army, which would just culminate a couple of months later in the Battle of Bunker Hill. Well, it's understandable that these retellings would embellish. Enough of that for now. I'll come back to that in a moment. One thing that most people don't realize about Boston is just how far north it's situated relative to other parts of the country. I mean, the same is true of Washington State, Montana, North Dakota, Maine, obviously. But the point is that most Americans don't realize that being that far north means that as summer arrives, sunrise occurs as early as 4:30 a.m. There was no daylight savings time to alter that, with the rays of dawn already lightening the sky as early as 4 a.m. And that was the case this morning. The troops marching from Boston, who, remember, had departed the town starting at 8 p.m. the night before, had been ferried across the Charles River and had marched for 13 miles for hours through the night, carrying their gear. They're now starting to see the sunrise, keeping them focused, awake, in formation, and in disciplined ranks, all the while them suspecting that hiding behind the trees there are rebellious colonists. Well, that's going to be challenging. And this is precisely the time when they arrived in Lexington. The advance guard of the British was led by Major John Pitcairn. He's going to be an important figure in this. They entered Lexington at around 4:45 a.m. It would not have been hard for them to see by the morning light about 80 Lexington militiamen standing in the common. So flanked by at least 50, depending on some reports, 100 spectators watching from along the road. Now, at that point, the population of Lexington, well, it was fewer than 1,000 people. Think of that. That's like smaller than a lot of high schools. These 1,000 people, assuming that most of those who turned out that morning were locals, including the militia, it means at least 15% of the town's population was present. Many of them, leaders included, had been waiting and discussing their response all night long. In fact, they were in Buckman Tavern, which I'll walk over to next, so you can see right across the street. And as it got later in the morning, Some were even starting to wonder, are the British really coming? Was Revere's warning at midnight even correct? Until a runner was able to come and say, indeed, they will be here within minutes. I'm standing outside Buckman Tavern. Buckman Tavern is just across the street from the Common. It's been here, a gathering place of the Lexington Militia on that night, but had been here since 1709. So this was a center of the community, if you will, and just across the street was a church which was standing at the time and then burned down about 50 years later, so it's no longer there. But this Buckman Tavern was where Captain John Parker, the local militia leader and a veteran of the French and Indian War, as was John Pitcairn, by the way. So Parker's role in the community was significant. Think about it this way. Of the 80 or so men that were assembled on the Common that day, a fourth of the men mustered there were related to him. Now, Parker understood from the intelligence he got coming down the street that he was severely outmatched, and indeed he had no intention to start a skirmish or engage the British regulars at all. But he wondered what he could do to make some kind of stand that would be meaningful. So as he got reports that the British were on their way, he ordered the men to reassemble in parade formation on the Common. Parade formation, not blocking the street, not trying to stop the forward progress of the regulars, but essentially saying, we want you to know that we are here. And this is important because there had been no declaration of war at this point. Even Parker knew that the weapons in Concord had been secreted or stashed, and so he knew that the British were likely to march out there, find nothing, and march back exhausted, and that would be kind of hilarious. But he still ordered his men to stay here and essentially stare down the 700 men that marched by as these 80 men stood at parade rest. So all along the path to this day, in fact, even though there had been casualties on both sides going back to 1770, as I've described in the other videos, at no point had any official, British general, captain, lieutenant, or colonial militia leader or son of liberty, no one had ever given a formal order to shoot. That would have been a provocation to war. Thus, even though warlike things had already occurred, there was always some amount of deniability on both sides that either side intended to start a real war. April 19th is the day when that changed. But it wasn't at Lexington that happened. But it is definitely because of Lexington that the energy that eventually assembled with the men at Concord made that happen. So at this point, Parker, knowing that he could just let the British march onward to Concord, so I'm standing right now at this critical moment, I'm looking down the road that they would have come down, and all they had to do was go down this side of me, follow that road, and they will make it to Concord unmolested. And in fact, it's very interesting because, well, think of it this way. One right or left turn might have made the difference in starting the Revolutionary War. Because when Marine Lieutenant Jesse Adair, at the very head of the advance guard, came to the Common, he decided, apparently on his own, to protect the rest of the British column by turning right, leading the companies essentially adjacent to and then on to the Common, thinking to surround and maybe disarm the militia. That right turn made all the difference. It became confusing and disorienting on all sides, and what ensued later would take years to untangle, and many of the details we still don't have straight now. To its credit, Lexington has decided to invest heavily in rebuilding some of the area around here, including their downtown. So there's a lot of orange barriers around. It's going to stop me from getting too close to some of these sites, but that's fine. Let me show you the first one of these. This is the stone which has stood here to commemorate the words of Captain Parker. Now I'm going to read them to you, and I want you to think of these words from the perspective of history, because a soldier of his, or a militiaman of his, said, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." These are surely dramatic, warlike words, recalled perhaps with the hindsight of knowing what that day would eventually become. Parker himself, however, did not say that he said those words. Instead, he testified, and I quote from him directly, that he, quote, concluded not to be discovered or meddle or make with said regular troops if they should approach, unless they should insult or molest us. And upon their sudden approach, I immediately ordered our militia to disperse and not to fire. It's not so much about, think of it as a kind of David and Goliath metaphor, where this scrappy little colony is able to stand up to the British crown in all of its glory. I mean, that metaphor actually works for the rest of the war. It just doesn't work for what happened here at Lexington. So let's go back for a minute. If we now have along this side, we have Marine Lieutenant Jesse Adair with his light infantry unit covering this flank, one can assume that they thought that they would be protecting the regular column, as the column was going to go in front of me here where you can't see. So if we assume that's what he was trying to do, but it necessarily meant that, and let me try to help you visualize this. To my left, running at my left, is the road that goes not to Concord, and is the road that Adair chose to station his infantry unit, going at not even a right angle. It's probably a 60-degree angle from that turn back there that Adair took one direction is to Concord. So I'm standing facing essentially what's a triangle. So you end up with me in the position, almost, if I keep walking backward here, I'm in the position where the militiamen stood in their parade rest, 80 of them, looking ahead and seeing the British come, seeing Adair come and flank them on this side, and then seeing Major John Pitcairn, who then came with his units, his 3 full units, and start to go up the other side. You are now surrounded. So these are the conditions under which the order from Captain Parker came to disperse and not to fire. Roughly about the same time that Parker is ordering his men to disperse, Major Pitcairn, riding on his horse coming from this other side, rides out onto the common and calls out the militiamen and tells them to lay down their arms and to disperse. Now, that's an interesting request. He may not have known that Captain Parker had already ordered them to disperse or was in the act of doing so. And we're not even sure it was Pitcairn, because there are multiple and conflicting eyewitness accounts. We're not even sure it was Pitcairn that rode out and issued this command. But someone on the green said that Pitcairn yelled, "Lay down your arms, you danged rebels," which sounded like a threat, especially because, remember, the whole reason that the militia were trying to stage a show of force was to intimidate the British from collecting weapons that belonged to each household, each man standing on the green. So this was, telling them to disperse would be one thing, but telling them to lay down their arms before they disperse, well, that's quite a bigger threat. Now, from Pitcairn's side, he insists that he was merely trying to maintain order because he had people coming from this side under Adair, and he had his own people getting restless and nervous because remember, 100 people potentially on any side of these streets watching them march. They're worried that they're going to get ambushed, and it's very likely that there were people with firearms in the bushes and in the trees around the area. So if you're a British soldier, you've been marching all night, it makes a little bit of sense that you're nervous. And by the way, you've come in muskets loaded. So they are actually prepared for a skirmish if it has to happen. But Pitcairn never orders it. So when that contention starts to arise, an interesting fact of history, this is so fascinating that it ends up bearing on the events of the day. But Parker, an older man, was also suffering from tuberculosis. And so he actually, his voice, as he's trying to shout above the rising din, he's unable to really communicate clearly. Some of the men probably didn't hear him, or if they heard his scratchy, tubercular voice, might not have understood his command. So it results in some of the militiamen starting to run away or back out, some of them not doing so, some of them still looking around, what are my orders? And it's in this confusion that a shot is fired. Welcome to one of the most debated points in the history of the Revolutionary War. No one has presented a clear case for who fired that shot, or even if it was a single shot. No one knows what side they belonged to. No one knows where they were physically located or in what direction they aimed. Eyewitnesses present on both sides make conflicting claims about who fired. Some claimed it was even an onlooker, as I mentioned, from the bushes on the side. Regardless of where the shot came from, it was enough to precipitate the skirmish here on these grounds that we call the battle at Lexington Common. Put yourself in the shoes of the British soldier. You marched all night. You've come muskets loaded because you believe that you are under threat. And technically you are under threat. There's a militia standing in the green right there with 80 men bearing musket as well. So you're a little edgy. A shot rings out, and what do? You fire back, and many did. Within just moments, enough shot had been fired that 8 men from the militia are dead. Another 10 are wounded. This casualty rate of 10% dead of the 80 that were present and another 10 or 12% wounded, that's a number that's absolutely horrible, especially given that no one actually ordered anyone to open fire. Remember, that's important. No one had declared war yet. At this point, this was an accident. Like so many accidents before, like the Boston Massacre. It's not going to stay an accident because of what happens in Concord. But at this point, this 10% casualty rate is horrific. And it's also going to be a number that haunts the British for the rest of the day. I'm standing now about on the line here on the green where the militiamen would have stood. Behind me, residential homes. To this side, where the 5th Light Infantry Unit was coming onto the green once shots were fired. They got their bayonets up. Some of the men that were wounded or died from shot or bayonet or both. The other side over here is where Major Pitcairn is staging many, many more troops and is the road to Concord. So I'm right here in this wedge, this triangle of where these men stood and where these 8 men died. Imagine the British. So Pitcairn, who turns out to be a very responsible and careful soldier. He's struggling to get his men to heal. He's trying to call these exhausted yet now adrenaline-soaked soldiers to order. He's reforming their ranks. And then weirdly, Adair appears to order the firing of a victory volley. Odd. And then they just simply reform those ranks and march. They march on out to Concord. They've got 12 more miles to go. They don't stop and try to look for Adams or Hancock. That was really never part of their plan. I've been here before when the locals reenact this brief but momentous occasion. When we first moved to the area, and I heard, you can get the sense I get out of the enjoyment of history, I heard that this occurred here. I thought, we've got to go. And I took my little family here in the dark. We were assembled over there on the green. It's very crowded. You're packed in like sardines. It's dark. We're sipping hot cocoa. The kids are wondering, like, why are we here wrapped in blankets? And then the reenactment occurs. And you can kind of see over some people in front of you. They won't let you put your kids on your shoulders because it blocks the people behind you. So all the more reason for the kids to be like, why are we here, Dad? But anyway, here's the thing. If you don't pay close attention, you can miss the entire reenactment. It's that fast. And when you do watch it, you might come away feeling like, was that it? What happened? However, at the time, I remember one thing very vividly. And I'll kind of give you the POV that I had as I stood just over here and watched this with my family. We were able to see one particular event that was dramatized, an event that went beyond the firing of the musket and the mustering of the troops. An event where one of the men injured, mortally so, in the volley, falls to the ground and crawls to his home right there. And along the way, gasps for air and breath and ultimately dies on the porch. This image is the thing that I retained from the whole reenactment experience. It was haunting. And I'll tell you, every friend or family member who comes to visit us and is willing to subject themselves to the James tour of Boston history, I've brought them here and I've told them that story. The truth be told, the more detail I've tried to get on this story so I could tell it better, the more elusive it has become. So let me turn to the purpose of this entire discussion. Welcome to the Year of Living Manly. In this project, I'm exploring the role of masculinity in men's lives and the lives of the people they care about, the people in their communities. As I have shown many times over in the videos in my series, 41% of men in America consider themselves very masculine. This is from a survey I conducted of over 700 men representative of the men of the United States. They rank themselves as 5 out of 5 on a 1 to 5 scale, and I've explained why that's very unusual for social science metrics in a prior video, but trust me, I did not expect this. Now, it's especially interesting for me, a solid 4 out of 5 on a scale of masculinity, and if you're someone who has listened to the narrative about masculinity, you might be tempted to say, oh, those 5 out of 5 men, they're the bad ones. We got to keep our eye on them. Turns out that's not true. If you want to go from what you think masculinity is, fine, make that definition. It just won't be grounded in fact. Men who rank themselves 5 out of 5 on their own sense of masculinity, well, they're better than the rest of us men. They have healthier relationships, they're more dependable, they're more respected by their communities, they do more to serve and sacrifice others than other men. In fact, masculinity, as experienced by actual masculine men, not as covered in the media or in any other conversation, that masculinity is something that we really can't have too much of. The more of it, the better, for individual lives and for our communities. Now, as I explained in the first of these Men of Freedom videos, my purpose here isn't so much to tell the story of the opening days of the Revolutionary War, but rather to put myself in the shoes of, well, not of Captain Parker or even Major Pitcairn, but of the average man. Men I probably would have been a peer to, a neighbor to, or might have been one of, and certainly would have been one of if I had been a man of militia age. These are men I would have been called to muster alongside. Men like Jonathan Harrington Jr., the man that has been described many times over as the one who died on his own doorstep. Harrington's house is a private home today. It's a historical landmark, which means the owners can't meaningfully alter the home from its original colonial design. There is a plaque on the side of the house that explains the story that I've told many times. It says, wounded on the Common, April 19, 1775, dragged himself to the door and died at his wife's feet. As moving as it is to stand here and read that plaque, to contemplate what happened here, and even as moving as it was for me to stand on the Common with my fellow citizens and watch the reenactor crawl across the street. The problem with the story is it's probably not true. Eyewitnesses who were on the Common reported that Harrington lay dead near the line where they had formed in formation earlier that morning. Not on the street, not across the street, not on his porch. Jonathan Monroe gave a deposition to this effect, citing that Isaac Muzzy, Robert Monroe, his father, and Jonathan Harrington were the ones he personally saw were dead on the line. In fact, it's not until 1835 that a very celebrated orator, not from the area, Edward Everett, came to speak at Lexington during an anniversary celebration. So 1835 minus 1775 means that we're now 60 years after the event. Everett is telling events he didn't witness, and as I said before, possibly gave in to the temptation to exaggerate the drama of the moment. Because how could these 8 deaths just happen in a flash? How could the British just reform, fire a celebratory volley, and march on as if nothing that happened there really mattered? You can almost support Everett's desire to make the story last even just 1 minute longer. And so he told the story this way. Harrington's was a cruel fate. He fell in front of his own house on the north of the Common. His wife at the window saw him fall and then start up, the blood gushing from his breast. He stretched out his hands toward her as if for assistance and fell again. Rising once more on his hands and knees, he crawled across the road toward his dwelling. She ran to meet him at the door, but it was to see him expire at her feet. Beautiful words. According to J.L. Bell, this is the earliest account of the version of this story, told almost 60 years after it occurred. Now, in great detail, with great flourish, and honestly, in a way that you want to believe what's being said. Now, Bell himself admits that it's possible those facts are true or based on some version of the truth. So, Harrington's wife, Ruth Fisk Harrington, remarried 2 years later down in Boston, left the area. There's really no record of her ever saying or writing anything about this at the time or even years later. So what became of her is very hard to tell, therefore we can't attribute this story to her in any reliable way at all. It's possible that she told it to someone who then told it to someone, and Everett went and did some investigative reporting and found the story and retold it. Or it's possible that Everett just said, this is the story we want to tell right now, and it feels right. I'm not going to condemn or support Everett. It's understandable if he concocted or pieced together this account. It's a story that we desperately want to make true. And actually saying that it isn't feels like a shame. Because by admitting the likely facts of the story, it unfortunately serves to diminish the actual sacrifice of Harrington and the other 7 men who lost their lives in the volley and the ensuing bayonet charge. So, for the sake of history, let me recite the names of those men. John Brown, Samuel Hadley, Caleb Harrington, Jonathan Harrington, Robert Monroe, Isaac Muzzy, Aziel Porter, and Jonas Parker. In my own journey to understand what it means to be a man, it is tempting to ask whether I could have been a Captain Parker or not, whether I could have been a Paul Revere or not. The truth is, the vast majority of men who have fulfilled crucial roles in history have done so nameless. For every Alexander the Great, there are hundreds of thousands of men in lesser roles, many of them giving their lives. Jonathan Harrington was one such man. In my last video, I introduced you to Dr. Samuel Prescott, the first of my 4 men of freedom. And I continue to marvel that a man who ended up playing such a critical role at that moment in history, sounding the alarm to Concord and beyond, is impossible to construct a reliable biography for. We're not even sure where he died, though tradition holds on flimsy evidence that he died as a prisoner of war from illness while in British custody. In contrast, Harrington's fate is precisely known. He died on this common that very day. But the details of how he finally expired, even what injuries he sustained, all of these are details that are obscured by the mists of time, lost to us. And in many ways, that is the role that men of freedom sign up for when they agree to join their militia, muster on the common in the middle of the night, and do their best to support their community. This is especially clear today, when our Ukrainian brothers are lining up to do the same. Men losing their lives by the hundreds and then the thousands. Nameless to us this far away, but known and loved by their families, mourned by their friends and families. When you agree to man up, you are signing up for 4 key things. You develop skills that can be useful to others. You earn the trust of the people around you. You respond to the call to serve. And 4th, you are willing to take risks and make sacrifices to make it all happen. These 8 men who died here surely did that. And I want to know that I would too. Hence my focus on these lesser known names, the men that most of us men have to reconcile ourselves to being. Sincere supporters of our communities. Gratefully today, not usually by taking up arms, but still following the pattern. Being quietly useful, trustworthy, responsive, and willing to sacrifice. That is the goal of a man. All right, Thank you for this second in my series on the 4 Men of Freedom. This story, so moving to me and has been so informative as I've tried to prepare to share it with you. So much more to learn about Lexington. I'll put in links to books that I've read, books that I'd recommend for you to read if you want to learn more about this specific part of the Revolutionary War. But please, above all, enjoy and go discuss what this means for you today in your life and in your family. Next up, we make our way to Concord.